Hi, I'm Bob Kelly. You can hear me now. The Historic Advisory Committee is sort of the sponsor for these talks. We've done 3 of them. We're going to take a break, and then we've got 3 or 4 more scheduled for the spring. Before I get started and introduce Wilma, I'd like to just again acknowledge and thank Susie Mandrino for being here and taking care of all of our technical needs. It makes it much easier for us. And thank you to Babette Huber, who's the town historian and has done a lot of our talks and also has helped us put together other talks and come up with ideas for it. And also for Wilma, who is one of our best researchers and helps us pull together information when we do the talks. So thanks to all of you. And just a note, we've been doing, with Susie's help, we've been able to do this online. And Babette and Susie have reported that we have over 100 people viewing each one of the talks that we've had. So even though we don't get a large number of people necessarily for the talks on any given night, we have a lot of people that tune in later and watch. So we're very thankful for that. Tonight's talk is on the history of textiles in Ontario County. It's Wilma Townsend, who's a curator for Ontario County Historical Society, is doing the presentation, and it's based on an exhibit at the Ontario County Museum. So if you are interested in spinning and weaving and textiles and the role they played in an early society in this area, part of the country, maybe a lot of our questions get answered tonight. So, Wilma, thank you very much for being here.
Okay, is this on? Okay, great. Hi, welcome everybody. I'm glad you could be here tonight. Just as another little addition about the exhibit that we have down at the Ontario County Historical Society, many of the artifacts that you'll see in the pictures are in the exhibit, and the exhibit will be running through probably about mid-April. So you've got time to go down. We've got lots of coverlets and quilts all over the walls and lace and all sorts of spinning wheels. So it was a lot of fun to put together. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief history of textiles, the history of textiles in Ontario County, with an emphasis on Victor, where I can. So I'll be covering the period about 1789 to about 1900, and I will try to answer that question of, did our foremothers really spin, weave, and make all of their own clothing? Okay. So during and following the American Revolution, the manufacture of textiles in the U.S. was encouraged to replace our reliance on British imports. So the very early settlers in Ontario County continued this trend. For many early families here, raising sheep for wool was a very profitable agricultural venture. Farmers also grew flax to make linen fabric. While it wasn't grown locally, raw cotton was imported from the South for spinning and weaving. Early on, much of the work to process these fibers into useful textiles fell on the farm family and involved many labor-intensive steps. So although the settlement in our county began in 1789, as early as about 1800, there were mills with machines for carding and spinning and fulling the wool, built in just about every town, including Victor. The mills helped increase textile production and ease the burden on the farm families. But by the 1850s, 1860s, the cloth production for wool and flax was moving away from the farms and into larger cities and more towards New England. So Ontario County farmers continued to raise sheep and flax, but the raw product got shipped out of the area. So to give you an idea of just how much work it was to process wool, and then I'll tell you about flax. I guess I better turn the picture. Can I go back? Yeah. Okay. The shearing was usually done, it was done in the spring, and the whole fleece was shorn off from the sheep using hand shears. And it took a considerable amount of strength and skill to properly shear a sheep. And then next, the fleece was cleaned or scoured, and that removed the lanolin from the wool. And the typical scouring mixture used in the 1800s was scalding water and urine. And it was collected from everywhere, including people. The wool then was rinsed numerous times and placed on racks outside to dry. The coarser wool fibers were used for items such as horse blankets, and the finer fibers were used for clothing and household items. So once it was cleaned, the wool was carded. These are the hand cards that you would use to card the wool into like rolls so that you could spin it. And kids got to do this. Anybody who was able to pull back and forth could do this. Let's see. As the carding mills, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later, became established, wool was processed more often than not by machine. So you could get those rolls, it looks like roving wool, so you could use that to spin instead. Okay, processing flax was very complex and very labor intensive, and I don't even have all of the steps up here. But just to give you an idea, the flax seeds were sown in March or April with a harvest in August, about a month after it bloomed. And the harvesting involved pulling the entire plant out, roots and all. Then to dry the flax, the plants were bundled together and left to dry in a process that was called stooking. So it's a second image over. And then once they were dried, the bundles were pulled through a rippling comb of nails hammered to a board to remove the seeds. And you can see to the left of the woman in the picture there, it's a pretty good sized piece of equipment that you pull the first that's the first time that you're pulling the flax through this rippling comb. And then there's retting, and retting is sort of the combination of the two words wetting and rotting. So the flax stalks have to rot, and that's usually done by putting them in water for several days, and this dissolves the pectin that holds the plant fibers together. And then after that, you break it. You use a breaking machine with wooden blades that were used to break up the inner wooden stalk into smaller pieces, and that was called scutching. And you can see in the center bottom picture that she lifts that up and down and hammers on it. And then hackling is one of the last steps, and that's to prepare the flax for spinning. The fibers are pulled through a hetchel or hatchel. So this is a hetchel, and there's some flax that would get pulled through it. When this woman was demonstrating this at the Historical Society, this was not a delicate affair. I was kind of surprised because she would just throw it on there and pull it right through, not delicately at all. So this is a hetchel. You are welcome to take a look at all of these things afterwards. They're very sharp, just so you know. So once it's gone through all these steps and maybe a few more, you get this, which is the flax that is ready to be spun. Sometimes the shorter fibers will get pulled out of it so that you can use it for rougher types of cloth, and sometimes that's called tow, like a tow head. And so I'll pass this around so you can feel it, because a lot of people haven't, touched and felt flax. Okay, so most farmhouses in the early 19th century had one or more spinning wheels in them. The girls and the older women were entrusted with spinning the flax and the wool and the cotton into yarn. And by the 1850s, most spinning had moved out of the home and was done more than likely at the local mills. And then eventually the larger factories in the Northeast were spinning everything more quickly within a factory. Forgetting to turn the picture. So the drop spindle that's on the far left is really the simplest way of spinning, and it's probably one of the most ancient ways of doing it. The spindle revolves and the yarn is twisted around the stick, and that this was a method that was very portable, so you could walk and do this if you were really good at it. The great wheel or walking wheel is next, and that is usually used for wool. And you slowly release the fibers, and it's while you're turning that large wheel, and then it goes onto the spindle as you walk back. And then there's the flax or treadle wheel, and that's the smaller one, which you can do wool on it. But what it does is it's at a much faster speed, and it's greater production. So you pump the treadle, the wheel turns, and the flyer, which I don't know whether you can see it too well, but there is like a little wishbone type of part on it, which twists the flax or wool into yarn and then winds it right onto the bobbin. And then once the yarn is spun, it's wound off the bobbin and onto a yarn winder. And there are all sorts of different kinds of yarn winders. Sometimes these are called clock reels or click reels because they click when you get to a certain point. So these winders have 2 yards per circumference usually. So you go around 40 times, and it'll count for you with the clicks until you get a knot. They called it a knot of 80 yards, and 7 knots would be 560 yards of yarn or 1 skein. So that's how they measured it so that they could sell it too. Okay, this is a skein and it has X number of yards on it. Using the spun wool yarn as well as linen and cotton yarn or thread, weaving was done both in the home and at local mills. Although looms for making cloth were quite large, many Ontario County families had one in their home. Men and quite often women and quite often men would weave for their family as well as for sale or barter. And the loom works by holding lengthwise warp threads. So they're the ones that go the long way on the loom. And the weft threads is what's passed in between those long warp threads to make the pattern. So there were a lot of different patterns that could be created. The one type of pattern was called overshot weaving, which was one of the most popular of the textured patterns in the 19th century. And these patterns could be produced on looms in a family's home or sometimes in the local woolen mills. And bed coverlets were usually the most common type of item that they were making. And the coverlet that's in the center, that's just a part of it. If you go to the museum, it's on the wall, it's huge. And that came from the Benson family of Victor. And I'm just going to show you. This is what overshot looks like. The question was, why is it called overshot? And I'm not too clear on it, but it is the way that the pattern shoots over a number of the warp threads, warp threads, warp and weft, so that it gives that sort of bump to it. Okay. Then the item on the right is a tape loom. And this was used to produce very narrow tape, which actually I think you see on the flax there. That's a type of tape. It's not been produced on this type of loom, but that's what it would look like. And that was very commonly found in most homes. And the tape the tape loom is held between your knees, and so the weaving is done in front of it. I'll show you in just a minute because there's one right here. And the warp threads go through the slats, and you move them up and down so that you can pass the shuttle through it. And then the tape was used for all sorts of different purposes. They made thousands and thousands of yards of this stuff, because you needed to tie on your clothing, you needed to, finish an edge of a cuff, you needed to put it around like, a bag of grain or something like that. And it might even be used for decorative purposes, for like a purse or a hat. So anybody could do this. This was probably where young children learned how to weave, but it also could be done by an elderly person who needed something to do. Let's see if I can. Is this on? Okay, there we go. All right. Not sure if I can do this with one hand, but we'll try. So I started this. Actually, somebody needs to hold this for me. Thank you. So you tie it to something that's stationary, and you make it taut, and you would hold it between your knees, and you would move the warp threads up and down, and you would pass this shuttle in between to make it this is what you're aiming for, is this very tight tape. Yeah, and there you can still get looms, tape looms like this, or an inkle loom is another type of loom, but they just would whip their way through these, making thousands of yards of this. This took me a while to even get this far.
And would you move it up and pass it one way, and then move it down and pass it the other way?
Yeah, I don't know whether I can do it or not, but. So you would move this up and then pass it through. I can't do it here without sitting. Yes, we're going to show how to do it. Okay, if you just hold it down there. So you would pass, if you want it, you'd go one way through. Hopefully it'll work. No, I just undid it there. So you would do that, and then you can also push this through and tighten it down. And then you would change the way you would change the way the warp threads are, and then you'd pass it through again to make the next one. And then you can go through and tighten it down. So that's how that works, and you're welcome to try it afterwards. And I don't have a problem if it gets all knotted up. So. Great, thank you. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, and I don't have an actual example of this, but this is jacquard loom weaving, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen that type of coverlet on the far right with the very ornate design. So the jacquard loom was invented in the early 19th century in France by Joseph Marie Jacquard, a weaver and a merchant. So he was thinking about how much money he could make too. When he patented his invention in 1804, he revolutionized how pattern cloth could be woven. His machine made it possible for complex and detailed patterns to be produced in the fraction of a time that a master weaver could do this manually. His invention has an attachment that goes on top of the loom, and there are a series of punch cards that rotate through it, and that controls which of the warp threads, those are the ones that go lengthwise, should be raised to allow the weft thread to pass under or over them. Sometimes that what? Yeah, that's my next line is that the jacquard loom is often considered a predecessor to modern computing because of the punch cards, yeah. So Ontario County and also into Wayne County too, I mean, there's the Coverlet Museum in Palmyra that has a lot of these. There are quite a few of these jacquard weavers, and they worked independently, or they might come into your home and do this, or they might work at one of the local factories. And oftentimes their clients would provide them with spun yarn, usually in a deep red or blue, and then, if I brought in a lot of yarn, I could choose any of the patterns and they would produce it. When making the coverlet, the weaver would usually include the client's name, the year, and sometimes their own name in the corner. So the mistake a lot of people make when they see these quilts is they see the woman's name on it and they think she made it, and she didn't, because you wouldn't have this in a house. It's in a regular house. It's too complicated. So the coverlet there was Hulda Gates' coverlet, and the East Bloomfield factory made it in 1834. So following the settlement in the 1790s, like I said before, the carding and fulling mills sprang up all over the place on the streams throughout the county. While many of the farm families processed wool for cloth, the carding, spinning, and fulling machines in the mills sped up all of this production and reduced the cost. So according to the 1836 Gazetteer of New York State, Ontario County had 131,000 sheep and was producing 132,000 yards of woolen cloth and 45,000 yards of cotton cloth and linen cloth per year. Yeah, it's a lot. And this was both home production and factory production. And there were 21 fulling mills, 23 carding machines, and 9 woolen factories at that point. By 1850, the local cloth manufacturing had diminished as the larger factories in the Northeast took over and produced, huge quantities of wool and cotton and linen fabrics. And also there were more and more imported factories that were becoming available in the dry goods stores locally. So by 1850, the Gazetteer noted that there were 100,000 sheep, but there were only about 5,000 yards of fabric being produced. And there were quite a few mills near Victor very early on in Hog Hollow, which is where School and Dryer roads cross. There was a carding mill. And in 1811, William Grimes erected a woolen mill in Shortsville on the outlet. And that was a big building. It probably was similar to the picture that's on the right. It was a 2-story building, well, this one's 3, but it was measured 50 by 36 feet, and it had a spinning jenny with 64 spindles, so you could do 64 pieces of spinning at the same time. 1817, Jonas Allen had a fulling and carding mill in Ford's Mill, Mendon, which ran till about 1823. And the one that is in the map there is in Brownsville, which, is right on the border with Victor. And that was run by Dr. David Brown. And he had a carding mill and later a woolen mill. And the ad that's up in the corner there is an ad to sell that mill in 1852. 1825, Erastus Hughes had a fulling mill and a carding machine in Railroad Mills, and that later got turned into a distillery, so maybe it wasn't as lucrative. In East Victor, on Fish Creek, near the intersection of East Victor and Breakaday Roads, there Elijah Griswold had a carding mill, and also in East Victor, there was a spinning wheel factory. So, yeah, that's something new that I just found. Okay, so you're probably asking, okay, what are these machines that run these mills? So what's a carding machine, what's a spinning jenny, what's a fulling mill? So I'll just briefly describe them. So this is a carding machine, which if you go to Sturbridge Village, you can see it working. And it's really noisy, but very interesting. So the carding machine prepares the wool for spinning. So it brushes the fibers to align them evenly. So the farm families sheared, sorted, picked, scoured their wool before they took it to the mill. And the carding engines brushed the wool into rolls for spinning or batting for quilts. The carding machines took only 20 minutes to produce what could be done all day with the hand carding. So carding mills remained in operation here until about the mid-19th century. So there's a spinning jenny on the left and the fulling mill on the right. The spinning jenny was an early multiple spindle machine for spinning wool or cotton, and James Hargreaves patented it in 1770, and that dramatically increased the production of yarn and thread. And then in 1779, Samuel Crompton made modifications to this machine to increase its production, inventing what was called the spinning mule. Both of these pieces of equipment were used in several of the local woolen mills here, and eventually just replaced the spinning wheels at home. The fulling mill was used to strengthen the wool fabric, and the machines had their tappet arms that raised and dropped mallets, handles that caused the mallets to beat and turn the cloth. And then that was also mixed with hot water, soap, and there was a lot of agitation to clean the fabric and make its fibers interlock more tightly to make a better material. It's sort of like felting or boiled wool type of fabric. Oops. Okay. So home and mill manufacture of woolen linens continued, as I said before, to around 1860. But even as early as 1800, Ontario County residents had access to many types of fabrics and notions that were quite often made in New England, or they were or abroad, and they were transported into the area. And you can see in the ad on the right that even in 1815 in Canandaigua, you could purchase all sorts of different kinds of fabrics, such as cotton goods from Rhode Island, velvet, flannels, imported silks and linens, and that's where you got your thread, your needles, pins, yarns, woven tapes, all of that could be bought there. Let's see, but once the Erie Canal came through in 1825 and the railroads by the 1840s, there were more and more products coming into the area, which quickly lowered the cost and made many more things available. During the early days of settlement in Ontario County, most families did make their own clothing. Girls started to learn to sew by the time they were about 5, and by their late teens, they were pretty adept at making clothing, mending, and refurbishing older garments. Wealthier families could hire a tailor or a dressmaker to make their clothing. By 1855, according to the census for Victor for that year, there were 8 tailors, 8 dressmakers, and 1 milliner, somebody who makes hats, in the village here. So you had options if you really didn't want to sew and you had enough money. And also shown here is the Gallup store, which was on the corner of East Main and Moore Ave, where you could buy these fabrics and notions. And that cobblestone building was built in 1835 by Thomas Embry, who ran a general store there, and then in 1857, William Gallup took it over and ran the store into the 20th century. The building did burn down in 1893, but he built another store after that. There, okay. One of the first permanent stores in Victor was opened by William Bushnell in 1808 on Maple Ave near East Main Street, about where the Unitarian Church was, that was the former Masonic Lodge. And his partner, Nathan Jenks, built the cobblestone store that's now on the corner of East Main and Maple Ave in about 1834. And that later became Simon's and Sons store, and that building, fortunately, is still standing. And you can see it in that photo there in the lower left. And to the left of that cobblestone building is where is eventually the building that's right next to the cobblestone building, and then further was where James Walling built the Walling block. So James Walling came into town, and he went into the clothing business in about 1850, and he had 2 tailors that were helping him. And then he later built the larger Walling block, which some people know as the Malone block, in 1874. And unfortunately, that building burned down in 1981. But he also sold fabrics, clothing, all that kind of thing. And then on the right are pictures of the Alte store, which is at Genesee Country Village, and it looks, the pictures show what it might have looked like in one of the general stores here in Victor. So there were bolts of fabric that were neatly stacked right up to the ceiling, a variety of yarn goods, notions. There are even flat irons and straw bonnets, as well as items for the farm or household use. So during the initial settlement, most needlework consisted of sewing and repairing clothing, but mothers continued the tradition of teaching their young children how to stitch by having them make a sampler. By as early as 1800, the local stores were selling the materials needed for creating these, particularly the silk thread that was used for cross-stitch. The early samplers were usually stitched on linen, and the linen was either local or imported. The samplers were most often the first stitches that a young child made. He or she learned cross-stitch as well as their alphabet and their numbers. And sometimes they even had some kind of moral saying that they stitched onto the sampler as well. The more elaborate samplers were made usually under the instruction of a tutoress, or a school for needlework that you would pay for. So that reflected not only the girl's domestic skills, but her education and her family status. And that's seen in the one in the center. So I'll just quickly tell you about the ones that are there. The first two pictures on the left, they're only photographs of these. Nobody seems to know where these samplers are. They're pictures that have been at the Historical Society for probably 80 years, and I've never seen the samplers. So Clarissa Jones, who made the sampler on the left in 1779 at age 13 in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. But it came with her when she moved here with her husband, Enos Boughton, and their children in about 1790. And she could use that as sort of a reference for stitching onto her linens so that they could be numbered and have their initials on them. And then Olive Stone made this little needlework bag after her marriage to Jared Boughton, and I think Jared and Enos are brothers, possibly. And she could have made it in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, or Victor. It does have her married name on it. And then the bigger one, which is kind of unusual because it's a double sampler, was made by Hypsibeth Cooper at age 11. And she did this in 1816 in Farmington at a private school under the watchful eye of her needlework tutoress, Priscilla Booth. And then the last one is Eliza Bemis's marking sampler that she made at the young age of 7 and in 1822. And I'll just show you the original sampler, and then there's a reproduction that I brought as well, which is made with the colors that it probably was originally, because we charted these many years ago, and by doing that you pick the colors that are on the back side of the sampler because they haven't faded. So samplers are pretty bright. So I'll just walk them around and let you see them. And sometimes when I've looked at a little Eliza Bemis's sampler, I've sort of felt like she really didn't want to do this, and it probably got tossed in the corner as soon as she didn't have to do it anymore, just by the way it's put together. Okay. So in the early 19th century, the sheets and blankets were most often made in the family home or by a local weaver. And a staple of every household, linen sheets wore well, and they were used for many years. The blankets were often made of homespun linen or wool, sometimes called linsey woolsey, and they often were marked in cross-stitch with the owner's initials and a number. The linen tablecloths, which are on the right, were made from very fine homespun flax thread, and the seams and the edges are beautifully stitched. They often were marked with cross-stitch with the owner's names or initials, and these tablecloths were made by Annis Fuller of West Bloomfield, and she very proudly cross-stitched her full name and the date on it of May 1824. The linen towel that's in the center was also made of homespun flax thread, and the flax was probably unbleached, so it's a little darker in color. That one was owned by Maria Granger Miller of Hopewell, and she apparently spun her own flax into fine thread. She was born in 1804, just so you get an idea of how young she might have been, and wove the fabric into a diamond pattern. And her initials MG are on it, so I'm making the assumption that she did this before she was married, probably in preparation for her new home. So here are 3 different pieces of clothing that were probably made from local and or imported fabrics. And again, I'll go through these and then I'll hold them up. The first 2, I have the actual garments here. So the man's double-breasted coat was made in about 1825 of navy blue fulled wool. So the wool went through the fulling machine and was owned by Abel Robinson, and he came here with his wife and young son from Vermont to Richmond in Ontario County in about 1818. They had 5 more children after that. It is possible, because Richmond had the most sheep in Ontario County, that he raised and farmed and raised sheep, and that this coat was made with the wool from his farm. I just don't know. I'm just taking a guess. It may have been made by a tailor to get the best fit in the use of the fabric, or it was cut out by a tailor and his wife made it. And it is all hand-stitched, of course. And then the middle dress was created in the latest style of the mid-1830s. It's imported silk that could have been bought in this county, or it could have been purchased, bought in New York City, maybe Rochester. But it was made for a special occasion with very expensive fabric, and it certainly was cut, fitted, and stitched by a skilled dressmaker. The dress was made for Mary Ann Beach Hutchins, who was the daughter of Dr. Thomas and Elifia Beach of Victor. So Mary Ann was the wife of attorney Allen Hutchins, and Hutchins, apparently they moved out to Michigan because he was a member of the Michigan House of Representatives. So according to the family story, she wore this dress to the state of Michigan's inaugural ball when it became a state in 1837. I'm pretty sure it was probably made here and went with her, because that area, Michigan was not as far along in settlement as we're here. She died in 1837, apparently not much long after when she wore this, and she had a 4-month-old daughter. And I think the daughter came back to Victor and was raised by the Beach family. And then the dress on the far right is, it's a cream and brown wool plaid, and the fabric could have been made locally, but it's quite possible it came from New England as well. Pamelia Cook Gates, who was the wife of Joseph Brown Gates of Hopewell, owned this dress and may have made it. So I'm just going to hold up the 2 outfits so you can take a look at them, and I'll just walk them up and down, and you're welcome to take a look at them afterwards. All hand stitched. Scallops. Yeah. You know, she may have been, had her child, or she was still pregnant.
It's like a normal size to me.
Yeah. Yes, here it is. It's all padded under here. Yeah. And all these scallops that are.
Are you day dress or was that?
It might have been a mix of the two.
The guy who wore this, that looks like a child's coat. He must have been a small guy.
Yeah, well, you have to think about, people were somewhat smaller. I mean, they weren't a lot smaller, but you have to think about their diet and, think about the stuff we eat compared to what they were eating in the 1820s, and that they weren't eating any sugar. They were just eating when they could, it was probably pretty healthy, so they were physically active. So they were smaller, and it was probably a younger man, too. Yeah. Okay. So now we have the sewing machines, and we're coming into an entirely different era of sorts. So few inventions changed everyday life as radically as the sewing machine. It was developed in the early 19th century, and it greatly improved the efficiency and productivity of making clothing and many other items that required stitching, like shoes. No longer did a seamstress have to hand stitch a long seam, like a side seam. Few sewing machines, early sewing machines were powered by either turning a handle or a foot treadle, and then electric machines didn't come in until the early 20th century. The earliest sewing machines used a chain stitch that could easily be undone if you pulled it. The lock stitch, which is what we have today, did not unravel, and that became the standard for household and industrial sewing machines. So on the left is Pratt's Ladies' Companion sewing machine, which we have on display at the Historical Society right now, and it's got a patent date of December 7th, 1858. This particular sewing machine is one of only maybe 5 or 10 known to exist, which I didn't know until I started researching. It's like, wow. So Samuel Pratt was in Boston, and he got 2 patents for this in 1857 and 1858. And it's a chain stitch machine. It was only on the market for a few years. And the center photo is of Mary Clark Thompson of Sonnenberg fame, and she's sewing on one of these probably something similar, or actually a Pratt machine. And her husband was an amateur photographer, F.F. Thompson, and he entitled this picture, "Two Sewing Machines." So. Okay. So the Howe sewing machine, the one that's shown here, was made in 1867, probably in Connecticut. And it's got beautiful mother of pearl inlay on the base, and the machine creates a lock stitch, which does not unravel. And Elias Howe is considered the inventor of the modern sewing machine. And he put together the work of earlier inventors with his own improvements and produced this machine that was very affordable and versatile. One of the ways that he marketed it was that he compared the time that it would take to make a given garment by hand versus a sewing machine, or his sewing machine. So he's got, one of the lines is a frock coat could be stitched by hand in 16 hours and 35 minutes. I think he timed his wife to do this. But when stitched by machine, it only took 2 hours and 38 minutes. So it was an amazing improvement. Trying to see. There is a label in the exhibit that does give a cost, and I just don't remember. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Research and, models in 1870.
You could have.
Looked it up online, and it was about 2 months paid
Yeah. Yeah.
to buy, but
So after 1865 or so, the options in Ontario County for purchasing fabric and notions and ready-made clothing really expanded. And clothing and furnishing stores increased in numbers, serving everyone, men, women, children. Dry goods stores, some of which could be considered department stores, offered textiles from all over the world for clothing as well as for the home. You could buy gloves, coats, stockings, corsets, any of those types of things could be bought in downtown Canandaigua or probably here in Victor as well. You could also get yarn, thread, ribbons, netting, lace-making items. For those kinds of things, women were using more of those magazines like the Godey's Ladies book to, sort of create all this Victorian frills and fluff. The bright orange stockings are made out of wool, and they've got a cable pattern down the front of them. They're machine knit, and they probably were purchased in one of the Victor stores here in about 1900. And they were from a member of the Aldridge family here in Victor, and if you look carefully, and again, if you see they're in the exhibit, you can see all the repairs that have been done to the heel. And then I'll pick up and show you this little girl's dress. It's not in the picture, but I wanted to bring it because it's such a cute little dress. This dress was made in 1875. It's of fine wool with blue piping, and it probably was made with fabric that was bought like at the Gallup store or the Simon store. It's both machine and hand stitched, and it's been mended a lot. I think it was very well loved. And it comes from I don't know whether I'm pronouncing this right, Marquis or Marquis? Yeah, Bowerman family in the Victor Farmington area, and it may have been worn by Carrie Phillips Marquis, who was born in 1868. So I'll just bring it around real quick.
This was well known. It's hand all of the, yeah, it is long. All the other. It might, but it's got, it's got probably a little girl had gotten a little too big and it ripped.
Okay. I wish I could have brought this dress with me, but it was just more. So this dress, Amelia Boughton wore this beautiful deep purple dress for her marriage on June 16th, 1880 to Albert Klein Aldridge in Victor. And the family house still is standing on Aldridge Road. Ruth Aldridge Harder, who was the granddaughter of Amelia and Albert, donated the dress probably about 5 years ago before she passed away. It's made in the latest style. The dress has a fitted bodice, long sleeves, a skirt with multiple layers of silk fabric with purple fringe, and a short train. Then over this, in the back, is an overskirt that goes over the back of the skirt and the bustle and has many more layers of fringe and fabric. We don't know where Amelia purchased this expensive silk fabric for her dress, possibly Rochester. It is certain that she had a skilled dressmaker cut, fit, and stitch it. The design for the dress may have come from a ladies' fashion magazine, and the dressmaker used her experience and skills to recreate it. Much of the dress is sewn by machine, but there are many details that are hand-stitched, such as the application of the lace around the neck and the cuffs. No, I didn't get that one in because, yeah, I ran out of room. Okay. So here we have some quilts. In addition to blankets and quilts, blankets and coverlets, the families often made quilts. And the first quilts in America were pretty much just functional, covered the beds, kept you warm, and usually were made of scraps, left over from making fabric. But once the sewing machine became available, women, and sometimes men had more time to create colorful patterns. Fabric might be bought specifically for the purpose of creating a quilt. Quilts usually were hand-pieced and hand-quilted, although in some instances the sewing machine was used to stitch the quilt top together, the squares. So once the quilt top was basted to the batting in the back, it was ready to be attached to a quilting frame. And this was often the stitching of it together, the actual quilting of the pieces of fabric was done at a quilting bee, which is shown in that picture on the left. And that was a big social event. Everybody got together and helped finish the quilt. It probably could be done in a day. And it's funny to look at this picture because there's a lot more going on in that picture besides the actual quilting. There's a little bit of courting going on around the younger ladies that are quilting there. And then the quilt on the right is made of silk and velvet, and it's in a log cabin pattern. And the fabric probably was bought specifically to create those vivid blue petals. And the quilt dates to about 1885, 1890, and it was either made by Cora Timmerman Holcomb or her mother, Elizabeth Timmerman, who are both of Victor. And it is all hand-stitched. All those petals are hand-stitched. Yeah. It's like... So knitting warm stockings and mittens and all those types of accessories was pretty common in the county, and using the yarn that was spun either locally or at the mills. But the development of mechanical knitting machines that were used in factories brought a decline to necessary hand knitting. So by the later 19th century, machine-knitted items were quite affordable and available in the local store, so you could go buy a pair of mittens and not have to knit them. The hand knitting became more of a leisure activity with patterns that appeared in women's publications for clothing and decorative items. Aurora Meach wore the hand-knit cotton stockings that are there, and when she married Melvin Rugg, here in Victor in 1873. And each stocking has a delicate scalloped lace pattern around the front, and I'll just quickly walk them around. Okay, and then crocheting became popular in the later 19th century, particularly with the publication of pattern books for crocheted lace. And the patterns were they were made of originally from old lace designs that had been turned into crochet patterns to make lace for clothing and decorative household items. And then the dress on the right was owned by Alice Luella Boughton Smith of Victor, according to her daughter Lois Bumpus. And the dress is trimmed with bands of crocheted Greek key patterned lace. And again, I'll just walk the dress around real quick. I'm almost finished. Crochet. No, this is the crochet part is cotton. And I'm not completely sure what the dress is. That is hand
The dress has been bought with, or were they?
No, you see the dress, it's stitched on. It was just part of the making. So last but not least is lace and lace making, and there were many, many different kinds of lace, and I won't even begin to try to explain them. Originally, lace was worn only by and was only affordable to the aristocracy. There were even laws that only the aristocracy in Europe could wear lace. No one else could. Producing lace by hand was extremely time-consuming and therefore a very expensive luxury, and very desirable because of that. So on the left-hand side, you can see bobbin lace being made, and it's created with twisting and crossing and braiding multiple threads that are wound on those little bobbins. And it probably would take thousands of hours to create a sizable piece. And people still do this. This was demonstrated at the museum. I couldn't do it. And then on the right is netted lace, which people actually were doing in Ontario County. But originally, if you can, in that enlargement section there, you can see that netting in the background. Originally, you had to make that net first. Then you could stitch the netted the pattern around that. But finally, somebody invented a machine that you could make the netting. And then you could just buy that and then stitch around it. So most women wouldn't have really had the time to make the bobbin lace or the knowledge. But by the early to mid 19th century, there were lace-making machines that were invented for use in factories. And this provided the middle class with the much coveted lace at an affordable price. So Victorian fashion just embraced this completely and used it in garments and decorative items for the home. Ontario County women could easily purchase reasonably priced machine-made lace in dry goods stores and millinery stores. And women did continue other forms of lace-making techniques like the netting there and tatting, which is in the corner there, and crocheting and knitting, which was you could see in those stockings and that dress. And then the handkerchief in the center has a fine white linen center, but it's surrounded by machine-made lace, and that was owned by Amelia Boughton Aldridge of Victor. So there it is, the brief history of textiles in Ontario County. And the answer to that question of did our foremothers really spin, weave, and make all their own clothing is kind of yes and no. It was a change that happened very quickly. And then, so during the beginnings of the settlement, there was some textile production, but eventually the development of the mills where the raw material was made, decreased home production. And then, of course, more and more goods came in on the Erie Canal and the railroads, and then the sewing machine came and really changed everything. So it made a big time savings for home sewers, tailors, dressmakers, and paved the way for buying factory-made clothing in the 20th century instead of making it all by hand. I mean, a lot of people still made clothes, but not spinning and weaving and all that. So, thank you very much, and if anybody's got questions, and you're welcome to come and look.
You made a mention of Lindsay Woolsey. Was that linen warp and weft was wool, or were the threads a combination?
That's a good question. I think it was probably the warp was linen and the weft was wool, but it could possibly have been spun together. In thinking about how things are spun, I don't think so. Well, oh, you got Google, okay, yeah. But yeah, it made a good solid fabric. But
The second question is, you've shown a number of samples of linen items, and some are, like the piece on the last slide, was white. How did they bleach the linen so it stayed white instead of turning dark?
They'd leave it out in the sun. They had bleaching products at the time that they could use to soak the material in. I don't recall what they were exactly, but that's most likely what they did. And they could dye it too. You could dye the linen and make it different. No, you could dye it other colors. But yeah, white is in the sun and bleaching it with whatever products they had at the time. Yeah.
Lindsay Woolsey is a strong, coarse fabric with a linen or cotton warp and a woolen welt.
Weft, yeah, or
And I'd have to
welt.
look up warp and welt, but I'm not going
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, warp's the long, weft is the one that goes back and forth. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I've got a lot of questions, if people don't mind. You mentioned that in the early years, cotton would be brought into the area and then processed manually.
Yes.
I don't remember when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, but was the cotton already gin, that is, having the seeds removed? Because that was a very highly labor-intensive process.
I suspect it was. I don't know, but I suspect that it was before it came up here. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this whole time of doing all this hand spinning and all went by fairly quickly. So, I mean, the point being that people, women in particular, were not spinning up until 1900. It was just that early part of the 19th century. So,
I noticed some of the dates is around the Civil War.
Yeah.
And how did that impact the ability of the North to get cotton and other fabrics?
it's a good question. I am not really sure. I know that the northern states were producing a lot of wool fabric for uniforms. So some of the fulling machines, fulling factories were still in production around here then.
Your question about cotton, two comments. This afternoon, I was at Rushree's library looking at some letters I need to talk to you about.
Okay.
But I was looking at a letter from a man from Texas in 1841, from Houston, Texas, to a man in Brockport, and he was saying about the spectacular quality of the cotton that was being grown in West Texas. He said it outstripped anything in the world in terms of quality, and he talks about, this is way before the Civil War.
Yeah.
But in terms of cotton, Rudyard Kipling, the author, his wife was from Rochester, and I was just reading a book about that family. And Kipling's father, who was an art teacher during the Civil War, the fact that the cotton from the United States couldn't get to England for processing,
Yeah.
that opened the cotton production in India. And
Oh,
that's when
okay, yeah,
Kipling's-
that
Kipling
makes
and his
sense.
father, his
I-
parents went,
Yeah.
and his mother was pregnant with him at the time. So they started getting, cotton was starting to come in from India
Yeah,
instead of the American
yeah,
South.
that's interesting.
Cotton gin was 1794. Cotton gin, 1794 for the cotton gin.
Yes. Okay, so you're welcome to come up and take a look at any of the items here, and thanks again for coming. Oh, you're welcome.